history of aggression in the Pacific world is a long and bloody one. The success of the Japanese armies in Manchuria helped strengthen the Japanese militarist clique, which celebrated the birth of what was piously called an independent nation. The Japanese installed the opportunistic Puyi as chief executive of the newly proclaimed nation. But actually, Manchukuo was nothing more than a puppet state, whose destinies were firmly controlled from Japan. This high-handed seizure of Manchuria was taken under consideration by another body of nations dedicated to preventing aggression, the League of Nations. Japan's delegate Matsuoka protested his country's innocence.
It is a matter of common knowledge that Japan's policy is fundamentally inspired by a genuine desire to guarantee peace in the Far East and to contribute to the maintenance of peace throughout the world. Japan, however, finds it impossible to accept the report adopted by the Assembly.
Japan subsequently withdrew from the League of Nations. That body proved itself incapable of stemming the tide of aggression, either in Europe or in Asia. It was inevitable that the Japanese militarists should one day turn their attention southward toward China. In 1937, China's large coastal cities came under attack. In China, Japan's pattern for conquest was firmly established. The Chinese became the first refugees of the struggle which was to grow into the Second World War. Shanghai fell to the aggressors in November 1937, and the Japanese tightened their grip on the mainland of Asia. 4 years later, Japan's program of aggression in the Pacific had grown to staggering proportions. From a point 300 miles off Oahu, Japanese planes took off on the strike which marked the start of World War II in the Pacific. The crippling of the U.S. Pacific Fleet in the Pearl Harbor attack left the United States with only a small naval force in fighting condition. The careful employment of that inadequate complement of ships was the job of Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet. The Navy's battered Pacific Fleet was all that stood between the enemy and further amphibious conquests. The U.S. Navy won 2 great victories during the first half of 1942. Victories which proved turning points in the war against Japan. In June, after the U.S. fleet had won the first round in an engagement with a powerful enemy naval force in the Coral Sea, the 2 large fleets met again off Midway Island. As in the Coral Sea battle, the naval engagement at Midway was primarily an air action. Warfare took a new turn in early 1942 in the Pacific. And American carrier planes, reinforced by land-based Marine and Army planes from Midway, dealt the enemy a crushing defeat. The U.S. Navy had paid back the Japanese for Pearl Harbor. In those early months of war in the Pacific, American fighting of stopping the Japanese advances. In the Aleutians, which lie between North America and Japan's home islands, the U.S. garrisons were particularly undermanned. American air units were severely handicapped by the unpredictable weather, and by the generally difficult terrain. Each time a plane left its base, even on a routine flight, there was a strong feeling of uncertainty about its safe return. Though contact with the enemy was limited in the Aleutians, it was of the most vital importance to the United States to keep the enemy from advancing along the island chain toward the American mainland. Southward, the job of containing the enemy advance was quite a different problem. In the jungles of New Guinea, Allied soldiers fought a determined campaign, helped materially by friendly natives, to keep the enemy from seizing control of the entire island and broadening the area of South Pacific conquests. The Aussies quickly became acclimated to fighting in the mountainous jungle territory. But getting at the enemy in that country was a slow business. Advances in the malaria-ridden jungle were made tortuously. Though the Aussies sometimes felt they'd been forgotten, there was evidence from time to time that they weren't really isolated after all. And as the Allies seized the offensive, the foot soldiers were supported in increasing numbers by new bombers, which gave the enemy a sample of things to come. On a tiny coral atoll named Tarawa in November 1943, the United States opened a new assault toward Japan from another direction. One division of Marines, the 2nd, was assigned the task of reducing this enemy stronghold. Tarawa was one of the most heavily fortified positions in Japan's outer defense ring. The 76-hour battle for that atoll assumed epic proportions. The Marines' casualties were heavy. But a most valuable piece of land had been taken from the enemy. Tarawa was a platform from which the American offensive in the Central Pacific would be continued, driving closer and closer to the main target, Japan itself. The Asiatic Pacific theater extended westward as far as India and encompassed the rugged, spectacular Himalayan country. The sprawling China-Burma-India area was one of the most confused commands of World War II. One of its few notable achievements was the building of the Lido Road under the direction of General Vinegar Joe Stillwell, commander of U.S. and Chinese forces. In the CBI, the ultimate target, Japan itself was as remote as the moon. The war, as it was fought in the CBI, was marred by jealousies and lack of cooperation among the command, a condition which was generally reflected in the dispirited performance of Allied fighting men. Fortunately, the campaign in the CBI consisted of a series of marginal actions, virtually unrelated to the broader war. The assault against the enemy's inner defense ring at Saipan in the Marianas came as a great shock to Japan. For this mountainous island, the heart of Japan's South Seas Empire, was within striking distance of Tokyo. The fight for Saipan was one of the toughest of the Pacific War. At Saipan, the Marines and soldiers who made the assault suffered some 14,000 casualties, 3,000 dead in the 25-day battle. Still farther west, an invasion of the Philippines was made at Leyte Island. With the assault on the Philippines by American GIs who had driven north and west through the New Guinea jungles, a promise made 2.5 years earlier was kept.
2 years ago, I said to the people of the Philippines whence I came, I shall return. I repeat those words. I shall return. Nothing is more certain than the ultimate reconquest and liberation from the enemy of those and adjacent lands.
America's newest long-range bombers, the powerful B-29s, took off on missions over the Japanese homeland beginning in late 1944. The trip from bases in the Japan and return totaled some 2,500 miles, just about all of it over water. No other heavy bombers in any theater had such an assignment. Finally, after 7 hours, the enemy's homeland lay just ahead. The enemy began to have some doubts about the invincibility of the Japanese war machine. The effect on Japanese morale was incalculable. Inevitably, the submarine was destined to play an important part in the Navy's war in the Pacific. Throughout the war, the exploits of American subs were generally classed as secret for security reasons. But their achievements, though unpublicized, were notable.
Down periscope.
During World War II, U.S. subs accounted for 63% of the total of Japanese merchant shipping sunk in the Pacific, and nearly a third of the enemy's combat ships sent to the bottom. Once more, in early 1945, a small, heavily defended island fortress had to be taken. And once more, the job fell to the Marines. The assault on Iwo Jima was one of the bloodiest chapters in Marine Corps history. Three divisions of Marines inched forward in the face of heavy fire from a thoroughly dug-in enemy. The battle for this inferno of 8 square miles raged for 26 days. 26 days of continuing bitter fighting. The Marines lost 5,000 dead and 17,000 wounded, but the rocky island was in American hands. In April 1945, an assault was made against an enemy-held stronghold even closer to Japan, at Okinawa. Offshore, kamikaze attacks on American ships by enemy suicide pilots reached a final frenzied peak. Navy lost 36 ships off Okinawa. More than 350 more were damaged. Casualties were heavy. The Navy alone lost nearly 5,000 men killed, and almost that many more wounded. But U.S. forces had successfully fought their way to the shore of Japan itself. In the 7 divisions of soldiers and Marines on Okinawa, there were nearly 40,000 casualties, 7,000 of them dead.
Amen.
With Japan bracing itself for an invasion of its homeland, a different kind of attack provided a terrifying conclusion to World War II. At Hiroshima, Japan, on August 6, 1945, the world moved into a new era, in which the threat of possible destruction of the planet Earth hung menacingly over it from that day onward. Less than a month later, in Tokyo Bay, on board the U.S. battleship Missouri, the formal surrender of Japan was made to officers of the Allied governments engaged in the war against that nation. General of the Army Douglas MacArthur presided at the ceremony.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored. It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. I now invite the representatives of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters to sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated.
The once arrogant Japanese, whose aggressive sweep across the Pacific had been begun less than 4 years earlier, had finally been brought to bay. The ceremony on the Missouri concluded the most costly war the world had ever known, fought over an expanse of hundreds of thousands of miles. On that cloudy September morning in Tokyo Bay, it seemed that a lasting peace had surely been brought to the Pacific and to the world.
Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world and that God will preserve it always. These proceedings are closed.
The enemy was finally completely defeated. The future of Japan was now the concern of the Allies, and particularly of the United States. The administration of Japan in the years directly following the end of World War II was firm and efficient. The American Army supervised the operation of the conquered country, assisted by Japanese who had been classed as trustworthy helpers for the overtaxed Americans. Under the guidance of American occupation personnel, the people of Japan quickly learned the mechanics of democracy. Despite the dislocation of its national attitude, the country rapidly recovered its composure. But before 5 years had passed, a new aggressor put an end to peace in the Pacific. The North Korean invasion of South Korea in June 1950 had far greater implications than the Japanese attack on Manchuria 19 years before. Acting with the endorsement of the United Nations, the United States quickly went to the defense of South Korea. But American forces in the Far East were limited in strength, and most of the troops were inexperienced. Through the summer of 1950, American GIs fought on courageously against overwhelming odds. At headquarters of the United Nations, the Korean fighting won top priority on the discussion agenda.
The Soviet delegate referred several times to, quote, the aggression of which the United States is guilty against the Korean people, end quote. This statement has been repeated over and over Through every Soviet-inspired channel on Earth, we've had it telegraphed to us by others. And we've heard it again today. It is a lie. It is a big lie.
The debate continued through the summer.
Who then is supporting the United Nations Charter and working for peace? The 53 members of the United Nations who are assisting the Republic of Korea. Is the Soviet Union one of the 53? No.
By August 1950, the other free nations of the world were sending troops to the support of South Korea. Britain sent 13,000 soldiers to join U.S. troops in the lines. The UN forces were further swelled by the arrival of 5,000 Filipino soldiers. Most of the nations which had fought in the Pacific War sent troops to South Korea. Australia's diggers, who had fought so well in the steaming jungles of New Guinea, arrived to battle under the UN banner. But the bulk of the fighting forces in the lines against the communists in Korea were American troops. As the tide of battle swept down into South Korea, then north almost to the border of Manchuria, then south again, and finally north across the 38th parallel once more, U.S. soldiers and Marines fought savagely to demonstrate beyond any doubt that the U.S. is prepared to stand behind the UN in resisting the aggressor. The path of aggression led once again to the same inglorious end. The North Koreans and Chinese Reds who surrendered to UN forces were far smaller in number than those who were killed while attempting to drive the UN forces off the Korean peninsula. In its predatory invasion of South Korea, the enemy suffered roughly 1 million casualties. Finally, just 1 year after the invasion of South Korea, Soviet delegate to the UN, Malik, indicated that perhaps the wind from the east was shifting.
The Soviet people believed that as a first step, discussions should be started between the belligerents for a ceasefire and an armistice, providing for the mutual withdrawal of forces from the 38th parallel. Can such a step be taken? I think it can, provided there is a sincere desire to put an end to the bloody fighting in Korea.
But whether the world was technically at peace or a limited war was being fought on some far-flung battlefield, the people of the United States realized that their country must be stronger than ever before if the ultimate war of world destruction was to be avoided. In the Pacific, on Eniwetok Atoll, the strength to resist any aggressor was being developed to the utmost. On the efforts of the men occupied there depended the life or death of the free world.
Freedom
In the 19th century, Herman Melville wrote of the Pacific,
There is, one knows not what sweet mystery about this sea, whose gently awful stirrings seem to speak of some hidden soul beneath. This mysterious, divine Pacific zones the world's whole bulk about, makes all coasts one bay to it, seems the tide-beating heart of Earth.
In this 20th century, the world is growing more and more aware of this strategic area, once explored by Magellan and Cook, and immortalized by Stevenson and Conrad. And now these once remote lands are covered with the evidences of modern history. The tie between the Pacific world and the United States, first established by the visits to the Orient of Yankee merchant ships, has grown increasingly strong through the years. Today, the affairs of this republic and the Pacific world are inextricably interwoven. A modern author, James A. Michener, has written of this mighty sea.
Our men lie buried there. Our ships and planes are in its bosom. And I am convinced that along its shores will be determined the precise quality of our future.
The war which engulfed the Pacific in 1941 marked the beginning of a new era in the history of that part of the earth. Never again could the Pacific Basin remain detached from the forces which were shaping the course of world history. The first truly global war brought to the Pacific the look of destruction and the smell of death, already familiar in other parts of the earth. The word Pacific no longer meant an ocean paradise of peace. For countless centuries, the peoples of the Pacific were largely untroubled by international crises. Life was simple for the natives of most of the lands touched by the world's largest ocean. It once seemed wildly improbable that the people of these remote regions and the exotic lands they inhabited would one day be swept into the main current of the Earth's affairs. The United States first became vitally interested in the Pacific world following the extension of America's frontiers westward. In the mid-19th century, the young republic pushed its way across the 3,000 miles separating its east and west coasts. The attention of pioneering America was focused on the territory which lay along the western shores of the continent. With the acquisition of Oregon and California, the United States became an important force in the affairs of the Pacific world. But the coastline did not check America's expansion westward. The same spirit which motivated the exploration of the western United States prompted other Americans, men like Secretary of State William H. Seward, to extend the range of American influence into the Pacific Basin itself. With the purchase of Alaska from Russia in 1867, the United States gained a bastion from which control of the North Pacific area could be effected. America's new territory was rugged, magnificent country. For well over a century, this land had been ruled by the demands of the Russian fur trade. No serious attempt at colonization and development had been made by its former owner. In the early days of U.S. control, Alaska was a land of opportunity to a number of Americans who had failed in their attempt to make a fortune, but who still hoped to succeed one day. The discovery of gold in Alaska in the 1880s provided a strong incentive for Americans to migrate to the new territory. An orderly system of land surveys was inaugurated before the turn of the century, and a succession of homestead laws became effective. But in spite of Alaska's natural advantages, the development of the new territory was a slow process. Attempts to speed up colonization were hampered by the frequently unfavorable climate. In many parts of Alaska, the weather was suitable for outdoor work for only a brief period each year. Early in the 20th century, work was begun on the Alaska Railway, which upon completion was to cover 500 miles of territory. But despite these intimations of progress, Alaska remained a sprawling, undeveloped outpost, whose new residents were clustered in a few towns along its southern shore. To the south, the Hawaiian Islands became a link in America's Pacific frontier in the closing years of the 19th century. Hawaii lies directly in the path of the trade winds. Its soft, provocative climate helps make it one of the most popular of American possessions. Hawaii today is dotted with evidences of its colorful history. Its discoverer, Britain's Captain James Cook, is commemorated on the island of Hawaii. And the memory of the reign of King Kamehameha I is kept vividly alive throughout the islands. This popular monarch, revered by the islanders as the Napoleon of the Pacific, fostered a closer relationship with the United States. Hawaiians are a happy, hospitable people. Today, the Polynesian strain, in its pure form, is not as prevalent as it was in former years, due to years of intermarriage with other racial groups. Ancient Polynesian customs are still celebrated in much the same spirit their ancestors observed in the days before the coming of the white man several generations ago. All the islanders of whatever racial stock revel in the native ceremonies. But life in Hawaii also has its modern commercial side. Honolulu, the crossroads of the Pacific, is the business hub of the Hawaiian archipelago. For many years, a few principal industries supported most of the Hawaiian population. Hawaii's increasing development and continued prosperity are associated directly with the size and quality of its crops of pineapple and sugarcane, the island's chief exports. Technical improvements in growing cane and extracting the sugar content have made the Hawaiian industry a more efficient operation than any of its mainland competitors. But Hawaii's principal industry was destined soon to be war work. Home base of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Hawaii assumed a tremendous importance as a U.S. war with Japan became a distinct possibility. Strategically situated almost midway between the American mainland and the home islands of Japan, Hawaii would inevitably be directly concerned if war broke out. With the tension in the Pacific increasing, Army units continued their rehearsals for a defense of the Hawaiian Islands against a possible enemy attack. To the west, in the far reaches of the Pacific, the United States acquired a valuable Far Eastern outpost in Guam in 1898, following the war with Spain. For many years, the new American territory retained its largely primitive complexion. Habits of life passed along from generation to generation were not quickly altered. When Trans-Pacific Plane Service was established in 1936, Guam was made a regular stop, and the island became an even more important link in the chain of American possessions in the Pacific Basin. And it was quite apparent that the U.S. recognized its importance. American rule was strict but paternalistic. The governor and his associates were Navy officers appointed to their posts, and the affairs of the island were regulated in precise military fashion. In 40 years, the Guamanian population increased from 9,000 to 22,000, a rise which can be directly attributed to public health measures initiated by the Navy. Guam was predominantly Catholic, like the Philippines, also wrested from Spanish rule by the U.S. at the end of the 19th century. In the Guamanians, the United States had gained an intensely loyal people. Under American rule, the people were classed as nationals, but were not granted the privileges of citizens of the United States. Most Guamanians, whose lives had improved somewhat in recent years, looked hopefully toward the day when they might attain the status of full U.S. citizenship. The U.S. was not the only great power gaining a foothold in the Pacific. In a strategic position in the southwestern region lie two important members of the British Commonwealth of Nations, Australia and New Zealand. These down-under countries have made Great Britain a more active participant in the affairs of the Pacific for the past several generations. The modern cities of the two lands today are inhabited by the descendants of the British settlers who migrated to British Oceania. This thoroughly Occidental society developed and flourished, though it was more than 10,000 miles removed from the mother country, almost halfway around the globe. Today, Australia and New Zealand are autonomous communities within the British family of nations. An industrious and progressive people, Australians and New Zealanders show an obvious pride in the steady growth of their countries. Although both nations have made considerable progress in developing their rich agricultural resources, there is still room for expansion, particularly in New Zealand and in the reclamation of Australian badlands. Both down-under countries exist on an export economy, for even if the purchasing power of the Australian and New Zealander were substantially increased, they could not possibly consume the enormous meat and dairy yield. The livelihood of both Australians and New Zealanders has been dependent directly on Britain's purchases of their produce. As these purchases fall off, Australia and New Zealand are confronted with the problem of finding and expanding new markets. For the problem of developing independent economies successfully could be solved only by the two dominions themselves. But while the bonds of empire were no longer as strong in a material and political sense, the spiritual tie between the dominions and the seat of the British Commonwealth of Nations remained as firm as ever. For centuries, the countries of Southeast Asia have constituted a potential trouble spot in the Pacific world. In the 30s, the stirrings of nationalism became evident in these heavily populated countries, peopled by a great variety of ethnic groups. Siam began to agitate for the return of territory allegedly usurped by the French in the 19th century. Its people dreamed of a greater Thailand, and a close bond was established with the Japanese, who sided with the Siamese in their modest territorial expansion program. Hub of the Oriental world for thousands of years, China held a dominant position in the Pacific Basin throughout most of the 19th century. China's principal point of contact with the outside world for almost 100 years was Shanghai, where British business interests first established a foothold. The economic life of all of China was related directly to the business affairs of China's large coastal population centers. Whoever controlled China's port cities exercised a powerful influence on the country's overall economic structure. The westernization of China's population centers had a profound effect on the country as a whole. China's principal cities in the 20th century had a decidedly Occidental cast. The lives of a considerable percentage of China's population were directly affected by the beginnings of the machine age in China. One of the most important aspects of China's modernization was the introduction of progressive methods in the manufacture of textiles. But modern methods prevailed only in a few major cities. Throughout most of China, traditional procedures were still followed. For even in the 20th century, China remained thoroughly Oriental in the conduct of its affairs. Many Chinese merchants still transacted their business chiefly in the local tea house. All classes of Chinese men enjoyed the luxury of spending a few hours at the tea house, where the patrons discussed all their problems, social as well as business, with anyone who cared to listen. Through the years, the local tea house became an informal extension of the magistrate's court. China's mode of life bore many striking resemblances to the manners of earlier generations. China's fortunes took an abrupt turn in 1911 when the Chinese Empire was overthrown by supporters of Dr. Sun Yat-sen, on whose political principles the young republic was founded. A disciple of Dr. Sun, Chiang Kai-shek dedicated himself to the task of extending the revolution throughout China. America's interest in China, which dates back a number of generations, increased steadily through the early years of the 20th century. The men of the U.S. Asiatic Fleet became familiar figures in all China's coastal cities. To many of the men, China provided the best liberty ports in the Eastern Hemisphere, if not in the world. And business was always good when the fleet was in. The regular visits of U.S. warships were made chiefly for diplomatic reasons. The appearance of a cruiser like the Augusta, even on a friendly call, could hardly fail to leave a vivid impression of U.S. military capabilities. But there were other visitors in China's harbors. Japanese warships, ignoring diplomacy, simply occupied China's key ports. For the center of influence in the Orient was shifting to the north and east. Japan was taking a more and more active part in Far Eastern affairs. The rise of the Japanese nation as a world power was closely linked with the religious convictions of its people. For the Japanese believed that they were ordained by the gods to grow sufficiently strong to rule the earth one day. Much of the ritual was dedicated by the Japanese Shinto priests to the interests of the imperial government. In these ceremonies, the people celebrated their national unity, their patriotism, their prosperity, the seasons of the year, the abundance of their crops, and any other aspects of their national life which seemed fitting. The principal aims of the state Shinto cult were to obtain support for the state, effect national solidarity, and create strength in critical periods. To the Occidental, the Japanese concept of existence was difficult to understand. In fact, until the mid-19th century, Japan and its people were virtually a complete mystery to the world at large. The home islands of Japan proper, although not large in total area, have supported a population of millions throughout recorded history. Every available square foot of land was carefully developed to provide the people with enough food for a bare existence. The basic social unit in Japan is the family, whose members have grown accustomed to living frugally. In the face of hardship, the Japanese have long been a stoic race. Women had a humble status in the Japanese household. But among the poorer classes, the differences in social standing were less rigid. From the earliest years of Nipponese history, the men have been great fishermen. The export of marine products has been a thriving industry since Nippon resumed contact with the outside world. During the early decades of the 20th century, Japan stepped up the development of all her industries. Foreign influences had a considerable effect in the shaping of modern Japan. Life in her large cities came to bear some resemblance to that in Occidental commercial centers. The reorganization of the currency system in the late 19th century eliminated the confusion resulting from the use of several types of money. A stabilized banking system provided evidence to the public of the strength and efficiency of the government administration. Although it took some time to achieve the readjustment from the old way of operating, the conversion to modern methods was made rapidly once the nation's business with foreign countries increased. The telephone, introduced in Japan in 1877, helped materially in bringing the country back into the orbit of world affairs. With their typical enthusiasm for anything new, the people soon became addicted to the use of the mystifying gadget. Once begun, the westernization of the home islands of Japan quickly gained momentum. As soon as they had become aware of what life was like outside their country, the Japanese addressed themselves to the task of imitating that life wherever possible. Once completely secluded, the Japanese now seemed obsessed with the desire to prove themselves as progressive as any people, any place in the world. But this craze for Western ideas did not completely transform Japan. Its cultural life remained virtually unaffected by Western influences. In the Western world's 20th century after Christ, Japan stood at the threshold of a new era. The cult of emperor worship was appropriated by a small but powerful militarist clique, which adopted the doctrine of extending Japan's borders by force if necessary. As the militarists gained greater control, all Japan was geared to the new program of expansion by aggression, and the energies of all Japanese were directed toward the building of a strong national fighting spirit. But the development of the fighting spirit was not limited to adults. Japanese children were carefully indoctrinated in the glories of war. The code of Bushido, the way of the warrior, was eagerly instilled in Japanese who were still moppets. Active military training began at the age of 6. From the beginning, the children were taught that it was an honor to die for the emperor, that they must become the equal in fighting ability of 3 soldiers of any other nation. Military training of grade schoolboys was a required part of their education. No doubt was left in the mind of any young boy that he was destined to fight and die for his country. By the time they reached their teens, Japanese youths were well prepared for their one mission in life. The warlike spirit was, by now, well nurtured. At every side, the young soldiers were acclaimed as divinely inspired warriors. As the recruits approached young manhood, their training was intensified. Every technique of modern warfare was drilled into the young soldiers. For accomplishment in the use of the newest weapons was vital if the enemies of the emperor were to be annihilated. The process of turning the young recruits into warriors was a complex one, but no effort could be spared in the development of the imperial fighting forces. And during the fateful 4th decade of the 20th century, complete control of the Japanese Empire fell to the militarists. General Hideki Tojo, and Yosuke Matsuoka gave impetus to a movement which was geared to one course of action. Barely 6 weeks after Tojo became premier, the Pacific world was plunged into a cataclysmic war.
Go for the freedom fight, let every tyrant feel your mind. For freedom and justice, forward serve, relentlessly marching on. But freedom's constant fight is eternal vigilance. Go forward, men of courage, in the freedom fight. Let every tyrant feel your heart.
Throughout history, the path of the aggressor has followed the same general course. The pattern of quick successes and the eventual downfall of the conqueror has been repeated through the ages. In the 20th century, this pattern was repeated once again at several points on the globe. In the Orient, the Japanese embarked on a program of aggression which was to follow exactly the time-honored course. For centuries, the Japanese lived in the conviction that their country was created by the gods as the center of the universe, and that they were destined to rule the world. This firmly rooted conviction was as old as the Japanese nation itself. Soon after Hirohito succeeded to the throne in 1926, as the 124th emperor, allegedly descended directly from the sun goddess Amaterasu, the program for extending Japan's rule began to gain momentum. The command of Hako Ichi-U to bring the 8 corners of the world under one roof was part of Hirohito's inheritance. Japan extended its control over a considerable area following World War I, in which it participated on the Allied side. The plums of victory included German holdings in China and the Mariana Islands, except Guam, the Caroline Islands, and the Marshall Islands, all placed under Japanese mandate. In 1931, Japan embarked actively on its program of conquest. Clashes between Japanese and Chinese in Manchuria prompted the Nipponese militarists to take action. Without waiting for any formal declaration of war, Japanese troops attacked. On September 18, 1931, Japanese troops seized Mukden, Manchuria's most important city. And on March 1st, 1932, the new nation of Manchukuo was proclaimed. The new country was supposedly independent, but actually it was purely a Japanese puppet state. The opportunistic weakling Puyi was made the new ruler and was later installed on the ancient throne of the Manchus by the Japanese, who kept a discreet but firm control over the affairs of the new nation. To all outward appearances, the new Manchurian leaders were merely friendly neighbors of the Nipponese. Actually, Imperial Japan dictated the policy in Manchukuo. In Geneva, Switzerland, in February 1933, Foreign Minister Matsuoka of Japan piously disavowed any aggressive intentions.
It is a matter of common knowledge that Japan's policy is fundamentally inspired by a genuine desire to guarantee peace in the Far East and to contribute to the maintenance of peace throughout the world. Japan, however, finds it impossible to accept the report adopted by the Assembly.
Traduction. Monsieur le Président, Messieurs, c'est pour la délégation japonaise.
With Japan's subsequent withdrawal from the League of Nations, its diplomatic position in relation to the other world powers deteriorated rapidly.
Le Japon a été membre de la société.
Japan set out quickly to consolidate its gains in Manchuria, which it planned to transform into a large continental war base. A program of planned economic development was initiated, and it was indicated that foreign capitalists would not be allowed a free hand in the exploitation of Manchurian resources. The new country was rich in mineral deposits, and the Japanese army, the real ruler of Manchukuo, quickly stepped up operations at key mines like the Fushun collieries. In the hurried development of Manchuria's resources, thousands of Chinese were pressed into service to work in labor gangs. The Chinese in Manchuria, who comprised some 90% of the population, had the choice of working for the Japanese for a meager living or starving to death. Opium was easily obtainable through a Japanese monopoly, even though laws had been passed forbidding its use, except in the case of addicts. But unauthorized persons were able to purchase the drug illegally and were then often fined for breaking the law, thereby enriching their new rulers on both counts. A government system of checks on opium addiction was announced and supposedly put into operation, but no effective measures were ever taken to curb the practice. In strengthening its strategic position on the mainland, Japan moved quickly to consolidate its control of as many railways as possible. After seizing the Chinese-owned lines, the Japanese army directed that new roads be built. Several important lines which link key cities with port facilities, and a number of branch lines. This ambitious program of railway construction was designed to produce a network of routes over which Japanese troops could be moved quickly to meet emergencies at any point on the Japanese perimeter. Control of the South Manchurian Railway, Japan realized, would be of vital assistance in any movement southward if Nippon were to extend its area of influence on the Asiatic mainland. By March 1935, scarcely 3 years after the new nation of Manchukuo was established, the Japanese succeeded in gaining complete control of all Manchurian railways. But Manchuria was only a short stop on Japan's road to domination in Asia. To the south lay the rich countryside of China proper, a territory which had never been out of the thoughts of Japanese leaders since the beginning of Nippon's program of expansion. In July 1937, Japan accelerated its timetable of aggression. Following a skirmish at the Marco Polo Bridge near Beiping, the war between Japan and China, anticipated for some time, passed from the period of small local actions to more concentrated warfare. After unsuccessful attempts at a truce, Japanese forces poured into North China from Manchuria, and an offensive was launched in the northern Chinese provinces. The Japanese advance against a somewhat disorganized enemy was rapid. Within a few months, the Nipponese had gained strategic control of North China. In Tokyo in June 1937, a new cabinet headed by Prince Fumimaru Konoe assumed control of the Japanese government. As premier, Konoe dominated the regime which threw Japan into war with China and brought it to the brink of war with the West. Committed to a sizable war on the mainland of Asia, Japan's militarists geared the whole nation to all-out production for the winning of that war, and any other wars that might develop as Japanese forces moved farther and farther from the home islands. While the other major powers of the world were still at peace, Japan was busy testing the most modern weapons of war and learning from first-hand experience which were the most effective in battle. In the air arm of the Japanese forces, pilots found that the new Japanese fighter plane, the Zero, was the fastest, most maneuverable combat plane they had yet seen in the air. But in China, older models still proved more than adequate. In China, the Japanese established their blueprint for victory. Nipponese planes bombed the largest Chinese cities, killing thousands of civilians. Special target of Japanese air attacks was Shanghai, which withstood a series of bombings before Japanese troops finally captured the city in November 1937, after a siege of 3 months. With the capture of Shanghai, the appetite of the Japanese army for still greater victories was whetted. The Nipponese troops prepared to press on at once toward Nanking, and an unforgettable orgy of rape and pillage. In mid-December 1937, the U.S. gunboat Panay in the Yangtze River was picked out by Japanese naval planes. The sinking of the Panay might well have touched off a war between the U.S. and Japan. But the pilots had made a mistake, the Japanese claimed. Among the victims were the first American fighting men to lose their lives at the hands of the Japanese. The Chinese became the first refugees of the struggle which was to become World War II. This was the beginning of years of being always on the move for many Chinese. Already, peace was only a memory. As the Japanese seized new territory, they took over the administration of the area at once. In some localities, the new rulers tried to act the role of sympathetic, understanding administrators. But the Japanese plans for further conquest didn't permit this act to continue for long. The Japanese badly needed the services of the people they'd conquered. Chinese farmers continued to work their soil, but now the harvest would benefit the Japanese. Many men were put into labor gangs. The Chinese had no alternative to working for the Japanese except death. Some Chinese labor gangs had the privilege of repairing buildings which had been bombed out by their new rulers. In one way or another, all able-bodied Chinese were worked unsparingly by the Japanese in their drive to bring more and more of Eastern Asia under the emperor's rule. With North China won and a continuing war with the Chinese in progress, the Japanese militarists looked still further south in their search for other lands to conquer. For the Japanese program of aggression called for a coordinated series of attacks on smaller countries with valuable resources, vital to the Nipponese war effort. The Philippines would prove a rich prize indeed. The Philippines had enough good timber to help satisfy Japan's wartime needs. On the mainland in Southeast Asia, Malaya was of particular interest to the Nipponese High Command. For Malaya, though not especially large in area, produced some 56,000 tons of tin each year, 30% of the world's output. Even more important was Malaya's wealth in rubber.
that British territory's plantations produced more rubber than the Nipponese could use. If Japan should find itself involved in a large-scale war, Malayan rubber would help materially in stiffening the backbone of the Japanese war effort. At the same time, by seizing the Malayan Peninsula, Japan would deny Britain and the United States, its two most important potential enemies, one of their principal sources of rubber. Singapore, at the southern tip of Malaya, had great strategic value to any nation waging war in the lands which lay along the equator. The base at Singapore had a commanding position with relation to the narrow straits separating the Asian mainland and the Dutch East Indies. The invaluable stocks of oil in these exotic islands made them a high priority area for seizure by any Asiatic aggressor planning to wage all-out war. These lush islands also produced most of the world's cinchona bark, from which quinine is made. Since quinine was the most effective preventive for malaria, the cinchona bark was of paramount military importance to Japan. Still farther south, Australia would prove an important prize for any warring nation. In the down-under countries, wealth consisted largely of wool and livestock, both valuable commodities. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, the Nipponese demonstrated their friendliness with another aggressive power, fascist Italy. The festive atmosphere was heightened by the favorable trend of the year-old war in Europe for the Axis powers. In 1940, the timetable called for further expansion on the Asian continent. In September of that year, Japanese troops put ashore on the coast of French Indochina, directly south of China. The landings were made without resistance. At Berlin, during that eventful September 1940, the three aggressor nations of Europe and Asia joined forces and forged the Berlin-Rome-Tokyo axis. The German Führer was well disposed toward making an alliance with any nation which would help further his own greedy aims, and which would not cause him any trouble in return. The tripartite treaty guaranteeing mutual assistance was signed eagerly by Germany's Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, and with equal satisfaction by Japan's Ambassador Saburo Kurusu. The alliance was further cemented in April 1941, when Japanese Foreign Minister Yosuke Matsuoka paid a call on Benito Mussolini in Rome. The Italian people acclaimed the representative of the strong Asiatic power, which would lend support to their dictator's own territorial ambitions. Japan's treaty with the European fascists gave it the opportunity it wanted to take over French Indochina, now controlled by the French Vichy government. In July 1941, Japanese warships moved into the harbor of Indochina's chief port, Saigon. The formal ceremony which made that country a Japanese protectorate was attended by the representatives of the French Vichy government, which was openly sympathetic to the fascist cause. Japan's army had gained an entire country lying along the vitally important coast of Southeast Asia without a struggle. Within a few days, Nipponese troops had taken possession of all of Indochina to the borders of fertile Thailand, still an independent nation. But freedom across that border was to be short-lived. In 1941, relations between Japan and the United States grew steadily more strained. U.S. Ambassador Joseph Grew informed Washington that Japan might well strike with dangerous and dramatic suddenness. Attempts to effect conciliation of differences were continued, but to no avail. In an effort to weaken the Japanese threat to the Pacific world, severe economic restrictions had been imposed by the U.S. Japan's exports dropped off sharply, and the economy of the country, delicately balanced with relation to its war industries and its foreign trade, was violently upset.
Japan's diplomatic negotiations did not mean much. The militarists who control already convinced that there was only one sure course to be followed. As the situation grew more tense, they pleaded for a unified national spirit.
The Japanese nation is faced with a serious crisis and will more and more carry out preparedness for national defense. Under the Emperor, it is expected that the whole nation will strive for the advancement of the Far East.
In Washington, on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, Secretary of State Cordell Hull worked in vain on new attempts at a solution to the crisis. But negotiations ended abruptly. Early that afternoon, he received two callers, envoys Nomura and Kurusu, who informed him that the Japanese and American positions were irreconcilable. In the Pacific, a fast Japanese fleet stood off the island of Oahu, ready to carry out Japan's secret decision to plunge the Pacific into total war. The pilots of the carrier planes which were to strike the first blows dedicated themselves to their task for the glory of their emperor and in honor of their ancestors. With the fleet less than 300 miles from the target area, the planes took off for the kill. Even before the Japanese envoy's call on the U.S. Secretary of State, Japanese bombs were away over Hawaii. U.S. forces had 260 planes destroyed during the attack and suffered the staggering loss of 4 battleships, a cruiser, and 2 tankers at Pearl Harbor. In addition, 4 battleships were badly damaged. Thus, at one blow, the U.S. Pacific Fleet was all but demolished. In Tokyo, Premier Tojo made it official.
The imperial rescript declaring war has just been promulgated. The valiant Imperial Army and Navy are at present engaged in a fight to the death. Now is the time for our 100 million countrymen to offer their all, to pay their duty to their nation, and to sacrifice themselves for their country. The rise or fall of Japan, indeed the fate of the Far East, depends upon the outcome of this war.
In Washington, President Roosevelt responded quickly.
Surprise offensive extending throughout the Pacific area. The facts of yesterday and today speak for themselves. I believe that I interpret the will of the Congress and of the people when I assert that we will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us.
Both houses of Congress acted immediately, with but one dissenting vote.
America. Therefore, be it resolved by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled that the state of war between the United States and the Imperial Government of Japan, which has thus been thrust upon the United States, is hereby formally declared, and that the President be and he is hereby authorized and directed to employ the entire naval and military forces of the United States and the resources of the government to carry on war against the Imperial Government of Japan and to bring the conflict to a successful termination. All of the resources of the country are hereby pledged by the Congress of the United States. Is the second demanded? Gentlemen from that, there can be no objection.
The American people, solidly united behind their commander-in-chief, volunteered eagerly to take an active part. During the next 4 years, millions of Americans forsook the pursuits of a peaceful life to fight the enemy on battlefields all over the world.
Freedom and justice for all the truth, be let us be harmony on. What freedom from the Christ is eternal vigilance. Go forward and of courage in the freedom fight. Let every tyrant feel your heart.
In every war, the aggressor has an overwhelming advantage in the early phases. An attack is rarely prepared for the aggressor's first strike. In the 1920s and 30s, the people of the United States gave little thought to war. The nation was geared completely to the pursuits of peace. But in 1940, the picture changed abruptly, and a year later, peace was only a memory. The Japanese strike at Pearl Harbor in 1941 was no isolated blow. At the same moment the attacking planes were over Hawaii, Japanese forces were sweeping south, spearheaded by an advance guard of fast Japanese warplanes. During the first month of war, the Japanese struck at Hawaii and 5 other principal target areas. Wake fell to the enemy after a heroic 16-day stand by a small detachment of Marines. Guam was quickly engulfed by the Japanese tide of aggression. The island fell after a few days. Japanese troops captured most of Luzon Island and were pressing the assault on the rest of the Philippines. The British colony of Hong Kong finally fell to the invaders on Christmas Day, 1941. Japanese troops landed on the coast of Malaya and were pushing southward toward strategic Singapore. On December 10th, just 3 days after the start of the war, Allied naval strength in the Pacific suffered another staggering blow in the loss of the British capital ships Prince of Wales and Repulse, sunk by the enemy.
The Imperial Navy's Air Force discovered the main force of the British Far Eastern Fleet off Kwanton on the eastern coast of the Malay Peninsula and opened brave and daring attacks. The battleship Repulse was sunk instantly. Pummeled further with repeated direct hits, the flagship Prince of Wales sank with a tremendous explosion.
Singapore was now a naval base without a fleet. But in the colony, the fortress was still considered impregnable, and the men prepared to fight what they confidently expected to be a successful defensive action. Morale in Singapore had dropped after the loss of Britain's 2 great warships. But it was still optimistically felt that even if the Japanese somehow succeeded in approaching Singapore, they could never take the island. This faith in Singapore's defensive strength soon led to a feeling of complacency. In the Dutch East Indies, defense preparations were somewhat more complex, since the island chain extended more than 1,500 miles. Native troops formed the principal garrison force. Most of the men were hastily trained in defensive techniques. But throughout the islands, even the best troops would be no match for the experienced Japanese forces. For the defending soldiers' knowledge of warfare was all theoretical. The Japanese pattern of conquest called for an ambitious series of coordinated strikes and invasions before the Allied forces had a chance to recover from their initial shock. Even before December 8th, Japanese units were en route to invasions of the rich countries of Southeast Asia and the islands offshore. The success of these attacks depended to a large extent on the element of surprise. In the early morning of December 8th, Japanese troops headed for shore at a number of points along the coast in the northern part of Malaya. Thus, from beachhead several hundred miles north of Singapore was the campaign against that fortress begun. Within a few days, a sizable Japanese force was successfully ashore, ready to launch a full-scale offensive against the British down the Malayan Peninsula. Additional Japanese troops moved southward into Malaya across the border from French Indochina, which Japan had occupied earlier, and from Thailand, which surrendered on December 8th. The advance down the peninsula to Singapore, 580 miles from Malaya's northern border, was made over rugged terrain. Japanese units encountered resistance by the defenders in the north of Malaya, but under the weight of the Nipponese attack, resistance weakened and the invaders gained ground quickly. Although the campaign down the narrowing peninsula should have been a difficult one for the invaders, they pressed onward rapidly against little resistance. The Malayan campaign was one of the most successfully fought actions in the series of Japanese assaults in December 1941. Within 3 weeks, Japanese forces had seized all of Malaya, south to a front less than 100 miles above Singapore, in the state of Johor. In Malaya, Japanese adeptness in tropical fighting triumphed over a defensive force ill-prepared for that kind of battle. Beginning on December 8th, Japanese planes regularly bombed Singapore, the prize of the Malayan campaign. The Jap bombers had a relatively easy time of it, as the Allies had no sufficient force of fighter planes in the area to combat the attacking bombers. Singapore became a prime target for Japanese air attacks, which had the desired effect in softening the city's defenses. In addition to physical damage, the attacks also achieved a lowering of morale among the defenders. The British in Singapore had not succeeded in becoming acclimated to the raids, and the Japanese took full advantage of their air superiority to pound the city without letup. Meanwhile, 1,400 miles northeastward, the British colony of Hong Kong became an early Japanese target. On December 8th, Nipponese troops advanced into the British-leased territory on the mainland, across from Hong Kong Island. 6 divisions made the attack against determined but ineffectual resistance on the Kowloon Peninsula. With the British territory on the mainland completely won, the Japanese turned their attention to Hong Kong Island. After a siege of 16 days, the invaders forced a surrender and took over control of Britain's great Far Eastern port city. With the capitulation of Hong Kong on Christmas Day 1941, the last major port into free China was lost. Lack of manpower was the key to the fall of Hong Kong, and the Japanese troops had their assignment made still easier by a poorly organized defense of the island stronghold. On Malaya, the campaign entered its final phase. In early February 1942, Japanese troops pushed across Johor Strait and entered Singapore, the supposedly impregnable fortress. The invaders pressed the attack. In their final heavy offensive, the Japanese took a considerable number of prisoners who had never expected that this unpalatable situation could ever come to pass. On February 15th, the British defenders indicated that they were prepared to discuss negotiations toward a surrender. Led by Lieutenant General A.E. Percival, commander of the British force, and escorted by a Japanese officer, a British delegation proceeded to the Ford building to talk terms with Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commander of the Japanese forces. Yamashita, the famed Tiger of Malaya, was anxious to get on with the business at hand. The British asked for time before deciding officially whether to agree to Japanese terms. But Yamashita refused to give an inch. His terms were immediate, unconditional surrender. The British wanted overnight, or at least a few hours, to consider the demand. Yamashita remained firm. Either the surrender would be made there and then, or Japanese troops would resume the attack. In the face of this ultimatum, the British commander capitulated. With Malaya on the point of being entirely won, the Japanese pressed on to other fields for conquest. From newly won bases, Nipponese planes took off and headed south on February 14th, one day before the fall of Singapore. The Japanese planes carrying a cargo of troops crossed the Strait of Malacca and were soon over the Dutch East Indies. Near Palembang, Sumatra, the planes disgorged their human cargo. This airborne invasion was made at a point where defending forces expected an attack. The Japanese objective was to overrun the rich Sumatran oil fields and then rapidly to seize the entire island. The spearhead units were soon reinforced until the total Japanese force numbered some 100,000 troops. Large areas of Sumatra were quickly seized, and with the surrender of Java on March 9th, Japan announced the complete conquest of the Dutch East Indies. Japan's program of aggression had extended its control to the very shores of Australia, only a few hundred miles from forward Japanese bases. Quick to capitalize on that proximity, Japanese planes again headed south as the advance force in the familiar pattern of conquest. On the morning of February 19th, 1942, a Japanese air striking force crossed the sea separating the Indies and Australia. The Aussies had their first intimation of the attack when the lead planes were spotted over Bathurst Island, just off Australia's northern coast. The first warning was sent at 9:37 a.m. By then, a large formation of enemy planes was crossing over Bathurst. The Air Raid Spotters Filter Center went into action at once and relayed the vital information relating to the plane's course to the Royal Australian Air Force. The RAAF sprang quickly to the defense of the port city of Darwin. A few Japanese planes were knocked down during the attack, but most escaped unharmed. A total of 90 Japanese planes made the raid on Darwin, 72 of them bombers. The attack, which began at a few minutes after 10 a.m., lasted for almost an hour and was eminently successful from the Japanese point of view. Darwin sustained considerable damage and soon became a regular target for Japanese planes. In those early months of 1942, the job of holding the enemy depended on keeping open the lifeline between the United States and Australia and New Zealand. For the shipment of desperately needed supplies from the United States was vital to Allied hopes for a future victory in the Pacific. Although the war in Europe drew the great bulk of materiel from the U.S., enough supplies were sent to Pacific bases to keep the Allied war effort functioning. Maintaining the lifeline to the down-under countries kept a considerable number of U.S. ships fully occupied. Fortunately, Australia-bound vessels were only rarely attacked. Each loss was keenly felt.
However, all of our massed effort is none too great to meet the demands of this war. We shall need everything that we have and everything that our allies have to defeat the Nazis and the fascists in the coming battles on the continent of Europe and the Japanese on the continent of Asia and in the islands of the Pacific.
The United States turned its full attention to the job of winning the war on both fronts. It was apparent that productive capacity would prove the deciding factor in the winning of World War II. Luckily, American industry was partially on a war basis at the time of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Lend-lease and defense appropriations had greatly accelerated war production before the U.S. was itself actively at war. The Pearl Harbor attack provided the stimulus to American industry to convert thoroughly to a war basis. In a relatively short time, the weapons and vehicles of war were being produced in quantities which would have been considered impossible half a year earlier. American industry was delivering the goods to Australia and Egypt, to China, England, and New Caledonia, to Persia and Alaska. American industry produced weapons and equipment not only for American armies, but for Allied forces all over the globe. Before the U.S. had been at war a year, American industry was producing more materiel than all the Axis nations combined. The U.S. was clearly supreme at the business of turning out the machines of war. Equally important was the job of training the men who were to use that equipment. Preparation for battle in modern warfare meant strenuous training for the men who were to fight it. Especially in the Pacific theater, the men had to be prepared for battle conditions and tactics that had no precedent in American military history.
The gentle art of killing a man is to get him on the ground and kick him in this manner. See? Sure. And when he comes back, get him through and I kick him. Come on, all of you do that. Zip, come on.
The business of becoming a knowledgeable fighting man required great versatility and techniques of attack.
All right, men, get your guns loaded. We're going down this village street. Clean it out. I want you to remember the enemy's at the other end of the street. You want to move fast, keep under cover, and shoot him first.
In those early months of the war, many soldiers were trained in types of warfare which they would never experience. Many units, later sent to the Pacific theater, had no training in jungle warfare. But thousands of soldiers and Marines were trained under actual battle conditions, with live ammunition. All this disagreeable training was to prove its value quickly, when the men found themselves in similar situations in combat against the enemy. In anticipation of a war in the Pacific Basin someday, the U.S. Marine Corps had been experimenting in techniques of amphibious warfare since the early 20s. Landing exercises had been part of the Marine curriculum for 7 years before World War II. With war in the Pacific a reality, the Marine technique of amphibious warfare was about to meet its sternest test. On both coasts of the U.S., new soldiers and Marines learned how to make a landing. And even more important, how not to make a landing. It took a while for the rough edges to be knocked off the boots, but the intensified training program turned out troops ready for action. In command of the men who were destined to seize the offensive in the first Pacific invasion were generals with a thorough groundwork in amphibious warfare. Men like General Alexander Vandergrift, soon to be commander of the 1st Marine Division. Marine training also stressed close air support of ground forces in all large-scale tactical exercises. Vehicles designed especially for use in amphibious operations were beginning to come off the production line. Though no one knew for certain in early 1942 just how the Japanese planned to defend their island fortresses, America's invading forces were well prepared for almost any eventuality. The time was approaching when freshly trained U.S. troops would help defend the free world against the aggressors.
the day will come. It will come when British and American armies march into countries not as invaders, but as liberators. And when from the soil there spring up in passionate hope and valiant effort the peoples who have been held down under the cruelest of barbarian yoke.
The U.S. Navy had embarked on a new program of building up its strength before the attack at Pearl Harbor plunged the U.S. into war in the Pacific. For Navy leaders realized that if the U.S. were to become involved in World War II, her Navy must be prepared to wage effective warfare with vessels which could outmatch anything an enemy could put afloat. On that basis, America's new Navy was developed. After Pearl Harbor, the reinforcement of America's badly crippled Pacific fleet was of top priority urgency. While the U.S. Navy fought a holding action in the Pacific during the early months of 1942, production was rushed on new ships, among them new carriers, from whose decks American planes would carry the fight to the enemy. Before many months passed, the Navy's score with the Japanese would be pretty well settled. In May 1942, part of the 1st Marine Division left its training camp at New River, North Carolina, on the first leg of a journey that was to lead to the very shores of Japan itself. The men who were to make the first American assault of World War II embarked on their trip in high spirits. There were enough interesting new aspects of life in Australia to occupy the curious GI's time in his free moments. Many Americans had never heard of a koala bear before, much less seen one. But most of the GI's time was not spent in relaxation. Their presence in the down-under countries had one purpose, and no one was allowed to forget it. Sparsely populated Australia and New Zealand were perfect training areas. There was plenty of space for long marches. Too much space, the GIs sometimes felt. In the early months of the war, Australia began serving as a base from which attacks were made against the enemy. At airfields in the northern part of the island continent, the men were no longer occupied with training. This was the real thing. U.S. pilots kept the Japs in New Guinea off balance in those first bleak months of war. But these raids were only moderately harassing to the enemy. Meanwhile, the Japanese sweep southward continued. In the Philippines, invaded on the day of the Pearl Harbor strike, the Japanese consolidated their early gains and set about seizing control of all the islands.
Freedom and justice forward, sir. We let us be marching on. But freedom's constant Christ is eternal vigilance. Go forward, men of courage in the freedom fight. Let every tyrant feel your might. Go forward, men of courage in the freedom fight. Let justice reign, let freedom come, fill every heart with joy.
For centuries, the Orient has had a potent attraction for the rulers of many lands. Generations ago, this fascination with the East was occasioned principally by its wealth of gold and precious gems. In this 20th century, the wealth of the Orient still exerts a powerful attraction. Today, in a new kind of material age, that wealth is measured not in gems, but in the abundant supply of natural deposits even more vital to a modern nation. Commodities like rubber and tin, coveted by all the great countries of the world. In Washington, in March 1935, an important new chapter was begun in the history of a group of 7,000 islands, lying some 10,000 miles away in the Pacific. The Philippines were represented at the White House ceremony by the President of their Territorial Senate, Manuel Quezon.
With this signing by the President of the Philippine Constitution, we have witnessed the birth of a new nation.
The people of the United States and the people of the Philippine Islands have been conducting together a great experiment. And during the period of the Commonwealth government, this experiment will continue until the ultimate withdrawal of the United States sovereignty and the establishment of complete independence.
But on the other side of the world, Japan had no such altruistic intentions toward its neighbor to the south. During the 1930s, the Japanese were preparing for the day when they would take away independence, not grant it. The military clique was in firm control of Japan. Steeped in the tradition of such military heroes as Admiral Heihachiro Togo, who had annihilated the Russian fleet in 1905, the military forces grew increasingly strong and assumed a more and more dominant position in the public consciousness. It was considered a high honor to serve in the armed forces and thereby become dedicated to the glory of the emperor and the imperial power of Japan. Pan-chauvinism was nurtured by the spreading of the concept of the divinity of the Japanese islands and of the Japanese people. Among the military, Japan's dreams of power were considered to be inspired by the gods. The acceptance of the militarists in the Japan of the 1930s was attributable partly to the fact that no wars had ever been fought on the Japanese homeland. The propaganda of the militarists presented war as a succession of glorious deeds and of heroic sacrifices made for the honor of their ancestors and in the name of their emperor. Soon, Japanese military leaders began to assume the stature of minor gods themselves. With this growing support of the militarists, the Japanese Empire moved closer and closer to a large-scale war, a war which might well involve all the peoples of Eastern Asia and Oceania. From the heart of Japan, the Philippine archipelago was only 1,500 miles distant. Lying directly in the path of a Japanese southward thrust, the Philippines were an obvious target if war should come. Japanese interest in the Philippines was apparent long before war erupted in the Pacific world. Thousands of Japanese had settled in the Philippines and had managed to make a fair living in the islands. The bond between the two Oriental peoples was stronger than most Westerners realized in the years which preceded the war. Relations between the Japanese and Filipinos were, for the most part, friendly. In many ways, the Japanese contributed to Philippine development. They conducted experiments in the planting and cultivation of abaca, from which hemp is made. The introduction by the Japanese of improved methods of stripping and baling the product helped stabilize the hemp industry. The Japanese produced more than 1/4 of all Philippine hemp, and it was largely top-grade hemp. Many industrious Japanese immigrants were among the most successful fishermen in the Philippines. Even the Filipinos admitted that the average Japanese fisherman was the equal of about 8 Filipinos. But the commercial activities of the Japanese were looked on with a considerable degree of suspicion by many Filipinos. Others considered the rumors about the Japanese fantastic. Of greater concern to a large percentage of the native population was the progress being made toward Philippine independence. The islands had been moving slowly toward that national freedom for several decades. These stirrings were stimulated by alert statesmen like Manuel Quezon, who had represented the Philippine territory in Washington from 1909 to 1916. and Sergio Osmeña, an attorney who had become Speaker of the Territories Assembly. In the 1930s, Quezon developed into the most popular political figure in the islands. In November 1930, the inauguration of the first president of the Philippine Commonwealth was celebrated before an audience of several representatives of the U.S. government and a gathering of proud Filipinos whose dreams of independence were gradually coming true. President Quezon worked toward the extension of the Philippine educational facilities. The University of the Philippines was to be the molder of the Filipino mind, was to produce men and women of character and wisdom trained in the arts and sciences, men and women who could assume leadership in the embryonic Philippine Republic. Philippine education had benefited enormously by U.S. supervision. The public school system, organized soon after the Americans took Manila, had been modified during the 1930s to meet the needs of new generations of Philippine citizens. The judicial system, which was established in the Philippines during the American regime, was patterned after that which existed under Spanish rule. In certain types of cases, a decision of the Philippine Supreme Court could be appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1934, it was ordered further that all cases involving the Constitution of the new Commonwealth be subject to review by the U.S. Court. In 1940, a bicameral legislature was provided for in a series of amendments to the Constitution. The Commonwealth's government now closely resembled in structure the government of the United States. Gradually, the Philippines were approaching the capacity for self-government. In the 1940 amendments, the term of office of the Commonwealth's president was shortened to 4 years. Like the U.S. president, the Philippine chief executive acted with the authority vested in him by a vote of the people. The Philippine president was granted broad executive powers to enable him to rule effectively in critical periods. But Philippine capabilities for defending the islands throughout the 1930s were slight indeed. Filipinos were thrilled by parades and martial music. But even in 1940, the Commonwealth president was openly pessimistic about the country's ability to defend itself successfully against a strong aggressor. The Philippine Army was being enlarged by some 40,000 conscripts a year. But at that rate of expansion, the desired strength of the Philippine Reserve, 400,000 men, would not be achieved until 1946. In 1940, there were some 6,000 Philippine scouts on active duty in the pay of the U.S. government. In this service, Filipino enlisted men served principally under American officers in a specially created unit of the U.S. Army. The most adept Filipinos graduated from the ranks to the status of commissioned officers in this highly efficient branch of America's military complement in the islands. At the head of the Philippine forces as Field Marshal since 1937, General Douglas MacArthur was placed in command of the combined Philippine and U.S. forces in the Philippine Islands in July 1941. The creation of this command by the U.S. bolstered the confidence of the Philippines in America's intentions toward the islands. Philippine cadets, modeled on the West Point product, cut an impressive figure in the waning months of 1941. The military academy men were well disciplined and well trained in the essentials of their profession. But for the defense of the Philippines, most of the manpower would be drawn from the reserves. In 1941, the reserve force numbered some 130,000 men. But they were still not completely familiar after 5 months of active training with the weapons and techniques of modern warfare.
Ready? Fire!
To supplement U.S. Army forces in the Philippines, the 4th Marine Regiment had arrived from its China station in early December 1941. The U.S. Air Force in the Pacific, which had consisted of a handful of obsolete planes in 1939, was strengthened by the addition of several shipments of new planes during 1941. For the defense of the islands in the fall of that fateful year, the U.S. Far East Air Force had 123 aircraft in operating condition, 33 of them bombers. Naval bases in the Philippines were far from adequate for defense needs. Cavite on Manila Bay could not have serviced a wartime fleet. Although this Navy yard served as home base for the U.S. Asiatic Fleet in late 1941, it was generally considered to be insecure in the event of war with Japan. As the situation grew more threatening, the men of the Asiatic fleet prepared for the moment when their presence in the Orient would assume far greater importance. For if a major war in the Pacific were touched off, it was readily apparent that that war would be to a great extent a naval war. Whether the U.S. Asiatic fleet could hold its own in far eastern waters against a large enemy force was debatable, but the men stationed at Cavite were determined to give it everything they had. For peace in the Pacific, time was running out. Early on December 8th, Japanese pilots prepared to take off for the glory of the Emperor on the strikes which would plunge the Pacific world into a catastrophic war. When Nippon embarked on its program of large-scale conquest, its forces were ready to lash out immediately at a number of targets of prime importance. From Japanese bases on Formosa soon after daybreak, the advance guard of the attacking forces started south. Only 270 miles away lay the great, sprawling Philippine archipelago. The attack plan called for strikes against a number of U.S. airfields scattered throughout the island. As the planes flew southward on their mission, ships of the Imperial Navy were already moving in the same direction. The Japanese had assigned an overwhelmingly strong fleet of warships to the operation, just in case U.S. naval units should elect to contest the Nipponese invasion of the Philippines. But the Japanese attack force was not challenged. In those early moments of World War II in the Pacific, it seemed to the men of the assault groups that a Japanese victory would surely come to pass. For this was the moment they were convinced that Japan was destined to succeed in the divinely inspired plan to rule the earth. Any nation which opposed the expansion of Nippon must be dealt with by the forces of the rising sun. How unfortunate for the enemy that he should be foolish enough to oppose the Emperor's warriors. In little more than 12 hours, the invasion of the Philippines would be launched. Japan's program of conquest had been set in motion. The fate of the Pacific world was in the balance. The Japanese invasion of the Philippines was conducted on schedule. The first landing was made on December 8th, and during the 2 weeks following, beachheads were successfully secured at 6 points in the archipelago. The Nipponese assault troops had been well prepared for this kind of campaign. On Luzon, the principal island, the strategy called for the forces which had landed at several points to drive toward Manila and seize that objective. The main strength in that push was provided by the assault group which invaded the island at Lingayen Gulf, 110 miles from Manila, across central Luzon. By Christmas, Japanese invasions had been made at 9 points in the Philippines, and the campaign to seize control of this important strategic area was well underway. After a thorough softening up process, the invaders pressed onward toward Manila, and what they hoped would be a quick victory on Luzon. During the first weeks of fighting on Luzon, the Japanese steadily reinforced their original assault units. As 1941 neared its end, the Japanese were succeeding in closing in on Manila from 2 directions. The Japanese plan for choking off the Philippine capital was working perfectly. Nipponese planes began bombing Manila in early December. The air attacks continued as the invading ground forces drew closer to the Philippine capital. The Japanese raids on U.S. airfields took a heavy toll of U.S. planes, many destroyed on the ground. At year's end, advanced Japanese units approached within sight of Manila, which was still bombed, though it had been declared an open city. In little more than 3 weeks, the spearhead of the Japanese ground offensive on the capital had driven within striking distance of the objective. Evacuated by its defenders, Manila was the invaders for the taking. The Philippine capital passed into the hands of the enemy on January 2nd, 1942. The Nipponese claimed they were liberating the island. But most Filipinos scarcely considered it liberation. Japanese propaganda units went into action at once, spreading the doctrine of Asia for the Asiatics. Are we not all of the Far East, they asked? The advantages of life in the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere were dinned into the consciousness of Filipinos of all ages.
Mga kababayan, ang mga Hapon ay hindi nating kalaban.
Some Filipinos helped the Japanese in their campaign. In Manila's streets, Filipino collaborationists spoke to their countrymen in Tagalog, a Philippine native tongue. The conquerors blamed the Philippines' troubles on the U.S. But their campaign was not an overwhelming success. Most Filipinos remained unconvinced. They remembered the story of Japanese rule in China and Manchuria. The greater East Asia propaganda continued throughout the occupation, but it needed strong backing. In mid-March, with the enemy in control of almost all of Luzon, General Douglas MacArthur, the American commander, left the island on orders from Washington and assumed new duties in Australia. The general arrived on the down-under continent to take over the preparations for mounting an offensive against the enemy at the earliest opportunity. The general's family, part of the small group which had made the hurried journey from the Philippines, remained as close to him as his military associates during those trying wartime years. This was only the first stop in a series of moves which would eventually lead the MacArthurs north again. The early months of 1942 were decisive ones for the U.S. The new commander of the Southwest Pacific Theater, General MacArthur, began at once to supervise the buildup of an offensive force. And the people of Australia were heartened at this evidence that the U.S. planned to build up its military strength in Australia. The presence of General MacArthur had a reassuring effect on all Australians, including the Prime Minister himself. In Manila, the start of the Japanese occupation was celebrated by the invaders with a parade through the center of the city. The seizure of the Philippine capital gave the Nipponese more satisfaction than most of their other conquests. Most gratified of all was the Japanese commander, General Masaharu Homma, to whom this day was one of the most memorable of his military career. General Homma would have found it hard to believe that this city, whose people regularly paid him deference on Japanese proclaimed holidays, would 4 years later be the setting for his execution for war crimes. But during early 1942, it was hard for the Filipinos to see beyond the Japanese occupation, to visualize their country again free from the yoke of the conqueror. Under Japanese rule, some Filipinos openly collaborated with the invaders. A few of these opportunists, striving for favor with the conquerors, had held important posts in the government of the Philippine Commonwealth before the fall of Manila prompted them to become Far Eastern quislings. Most active of the Filipino collaborationists was Jose Laurel, former Associate Justice of the Philippine Commonwealth Supreme Court. Laurel became a spokesman for the Japanese, and for his labors was subsequently rewarded by being made puppet president of what the Japanese euphemistically termed the Independent Republic of the Philippines. Soon after the invaders gained control of most of the Philippines, the produce of the country attracted their attention. A program of systematic looting of the island's products began. The new rulers appropriated everything they wanted, including vitally needed stores of rice, tinned foods, and cotton. In the tradition of aggressors throughout recorded history, the Japanese seized everything which might prove of any value to them and deprived the inhabitants of the produce of their country. Japanese greed in the confiscation of Philippine goods provided an effective contrast to the high-sounding promises the invaders had made to the conquered nation. The greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere worked in only one direction. In late April 1942, Corregidor in Manila Bay was the last outpost to resist the Japanese invaders of Luzon. For almost a month, the Japanese bombarded the island fortress with every weapon at their command. Finally, on May 5th, 1942, Japanese assault units crossed the narrow channel separating Luzon from Corregidor and stormed the rock's sturdy defenses. After nearly 24 hours, fighting on the island ceased on May 6th. That afternoon, General Jonathan Wainwright, the American commander, met with General Hama on nearby Bataan Peninsula to effect the surrender. At first, the American commander surrendered only those forces on Corregidor and neighboring islets in Manila Bay, but not the American units still fighting the Japanese elsewhere in the Philippines. Later, however, General Wainwright was forced to surrender all his Philippine units. And in a tremulous voice, he announced his action to them over the Japanese-controlled radio. The historic statement was recorded by the gloating conquerors.
This is Lieutenant General J.M. Wainwright. To put a stop to further useless sacrifice of human life on the fortified islands, yesterday I tendered to Lieutenant General Malik, the Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Forces in the Philippines, the formal surrender of all American and Philippine Army troops in the Philippine Islands. This decision, on my part, you will realize, was forced upon me by means entirely beyond my control.
General Hama, the Beast of Bataan, soon set out to visit the scene of the epic battle for the island fortress. After a difficult campaign which had lasted 5 months, the invaders had finally succeeded in overpowering the remnants of the American Luzon force. The final battle had been one of the most bitterly fought defenses in history. The victorious Japanese inspected the area with interest. The valiant stand made by the U.S. 4th Marine Regiment, with a mixture of soldiers, sailors, and Filipinos attached, will never be forgotten by the Japanese who participated in the battle for Corregidor. The victors were especially curious about the weapons which had caused them so much trouble before the assault troops overran the island's defenses. After the capture of Corregidor, the Japanese quickly gained control of all the Philippines. In the United States, a month later, the Philippine Commonwealth government was represented by its president in exile, Manuel Quezon. The first steps toward Philippine independence, so hopefully planned 7 years earlier in Washington, had received a staggering setback. But with the support of the United States, the Philippines would fight on against the Japanese aggressors to a final victory on some glorious future day.
I shall not tell the government and people of America what they should do by us in the days to come. Ruin and destruction have neither daunted our spirit nor lessened our faith in America.
During early 1942, the toughest job the U.S. faced was containing the Japanese overwater advance. That job was the Navy's.
For freedom and justice, forward serve, we let us sing harmony on. For freedom, constant Christ in eternal vigilance. Go forward, men of courage in the freedom fight. Let every tyrant feel your heart. Go forward, men of courage in the freedom fight. Let justice reign, let freedom song fill every heart with joy.
Prior to the 20th century, a naval war fought across the vast reaches of the Pacific would have been a physical impossibility. But with the advances in the employment of power in the field of transport, the Pacific gradually shrank to an area which could be traversed by a considerable force of fighting ships. As the 20th century progressed, the U.S. Navy was well aware that the Pacific was becoming a most strategically important body of water. Arriving in Hawaii some 2 weeks after the attack at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz assumed command of the Pacific Fleet. For the next 3.5 years, he faced the overwhelming job of fighting the Japanese in an all-out war under handicaps of staggering proportions.
We were faced with a gigantic job. The Pacific Ocean encompasses almost 70 million square miles. To wage war across this trackless battleground was an enormous task for any fleet or combination of fleets. With our crippled Pacific Fleet, the job in early 1942 was all but impossible. But with every available ship and every officer and man in the Pacific Fleet dedicating himself to the task, we were determined to carry the war to the heart of the enemy's homeland. The enemy had scored a devastating blow at Pearl Harbor, but it was a blow from which we would recover, from which we must recover. The U.S. Navy in the Pacific turned to and set about countering that blow.
Japan's strikes on December 8th turned World War II into a truly global conflict.
They have certainly embarked upon a very considerable undertaking. After the outrages they have committed upon us at Pearl Harbor, in the Pacific Islands, in the Philippines, in Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, they must now know that the stakes for which they have decided to play are mortal. Many people have been astonished that Japan should in a single day have plunged into war against the United States and the British Empire. What kind of a people do they think we are? Is it possible they do not realize that we shall never cease to persevere against them until they have been taught a lesson which they and the world will never forget?
The first move in the Navy's plan of attack called for the establishment of bases in the far reaches of the Pacific. Bases from which the Navy's warships and amphibious forces could attack the enemy in his own bailiwick. During the early months of the war, the establishment of those advanced bases on islands with unfamiliar names was a matter of great urgency. Inasmuch as the islands were not many miles from enemy territory, planes were the most important items of equipment. The bases hurriedly rushed into operation in the South Pacific in those early months of the war were in great measure responsible for staving off the enemy in his drive toward Australia and New Zealand. Without those bases, the U.S. would have been at such a disadvantage that it is quite doubtful that the enemy could have been checked in the far Pacific. But though planes did arrive at the new Pacific bases, they were few in number. Because of shortage of shipping in the Pacific, and because of the buildup of an offensive in the European theater, the air bases in the Pacific were scantily stocked with planes. When a small shipment of new planes did arrive, they were quickly assembled and ready for their first takeoff. The Army and its Air Force were convinced of the importance of these island air bases, which were often referred to as unsinkable carriers. Army and Marine engineers and Navy Seabees worked under constant pressure on the construction necessary to put the new U.S. South Pacific bases in operating condition. Everyone was well aware that he was involved in a race against time, for the enemy was in a good position to move a little farther south and overwhelm the U.S. island bases. The engineer units accomplished almost impossible feats of construction. Occasionally, in their haste, they suffered a setback in their progress. As the Japanese swept southward and seized control of the Pacific Islands in their path, they quickly built bases from which they could press the attack even further. Japanese military strength on its newly captured islands in the early months of the war was considerable. And the first concern of the Japanese militarists in taking over a new island was the preparation of the facilities necessary for the operation of an air base. But once the basic military requirements were satisfied, the Japanese relaxed, confident that they could hold their newly won territory without trouble. In those early months of 1942, the aggressors had a fairly easy time of it. There was even time for baseball, a game they still loved, even though it was the national sport of the hated American enemy. The Japanese Navy was proud of its submarine service, but somehow its subs had not been used to any extent as raiders of U.S. shipping. Though the subs were well constructed, the Japanese simply didn't know how to use them to maximum advantage as an offensive weapon. The Japanese militarists had paid relatively little attention to the importance of supply in the maintenance of its far-flung conquests. As they gradually awoke to their shortcomings on the planning level, the Japanese Army Command subsequently brought pressure to bear on the Navy to provide combat submarines for transportation of Army supplies. But the main elements of the Japanese Navy were used to full advantage. Japanese sailors were proficient in the performance of their assigned duties and possessed a strong fighting spirit. Not for over a century had the U.S. faced an enemy Navy so tough and well-trained as the Japanese. In February 1942, that Navy was at peak strength, ready and anxious to engage any Allied naval units which could be located. In late February, 2 Japanese naval forces proceeded southward in a pincer movement against Java. On February 27th, in the Java Sea, the Japanese fleets gained their opportunity. On that afternoon, the Japanese movement south was challenged by a ragtag Allied force of American, Dutch, Australian, and English warships, which had never operated as a unit. The Japanese naval forces went into action at once. The Allied fleet, operating with little coordination, was foredoomed to defeat. While losing no ships of their own, the Japanese virtually annihilated the Allied force, sinking 2 cruisers and 3 destroyers in the 8-hour-long action, and knocking out 7 more Allied warships attempting to escape. From that point on, the Japanese held complete control of those waters. But the picture was not all black for the Allies. In late January, fast U.S. carrier forces were assigned to move into enemy-controlled waters and carry out a raid on the Marshall Islands, a strong link in Japan's outer defense ring. Early on the morning of February 1st, the fleet was in position for the attack. Its planes and ships opened up against 6 atolls in the eastern and central Marshalls. In command of Task Force 8, in that first daring raid into enemy territory, Admiral Bull Halsey was overjoyed that he had been given this chance to hit back at the enemy. The U.S. striking force damaged a number of enemy installations on several islands. But perhaps even more important was the lift the raid gave to American morale on the fighting fronts and in the U.S. A few weeks later, Wake was hit in the first attack on that island, which the Japanese had had such difficulty in seizing some 2 months earlier. Early in March, Japanese positions in New Guinea came under attack by a fast U.S. carrier fleet, which effectively plastered the enemy at Lae and Salamaua. Stimulating as these raids were to American spirits, the U.S. High Command felt that something incredibly bold was needed. In mid-April 1942, the carrier Hornet moved steadily westward, equipped with a complement of B-25 bombers. Army Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle and the Hornet's Captain Mark Mitcher were collaborating on a top-secret assignment, a raid on Tokyo itself. The Navy's Task Force 16 was commanded from the Enterprise by Admiral Halsey, whose fervent desire to strike further and further into enemy territory was being gratified. Never before had the Air Force even considered the possibility of flying a bomber the size of a B-25 off the deck of a carrier. Although the Air Force personnel had practiced taking off from a restricted space at a Florida base, this was the first attempt at taking off from a real carrier deck. Every man in the fleet held his breath. The 16 planes took off at intervals of several minutes, early on the morning of April 18, 1942. Ahead lay the job all American pilots in the Pacific dreamed of doing. Admiral Halsey called the flight one of the most courageous deeds in all military history. The raid on the heart of the enemy's homeland had an electrifying effect on the American people. The strike group's commander, Colonel Doolittle, was justifiably proud of his team's performance.
The highly successful air raid on Tokyo was the result of weeks of careful preparation. Each pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, gunner, and the ground crews were volunteers and were carefully trained for the specific mission. The men and the officers did a heroic job.
But the Japanese were still confidently undertaking to extend their area of control in the Pacific. In an attempt to capture Port Moresby on the southeastern coast of New Guinea, a Japanese naval force headed south from Truk. The fleet passed through the Solomons area and moved toward Port Moresby. The invasion force included a powerful array of Japanese warships. The Battle of the Coral Sea represented a notable development in naval warfare. In the struggle with Japan, it proved a turning point for the U.S. in the course of the war. The Japanese fleet moved steadily toward its objective. Meanwhile, a U.S. carrier task force was searching for the enemy fleet. Contact was almost established several times. The American planes were prepared for launching soon after dawn on May 4th. Some were to attack a group of Japanese ships at Tulagi, but the plan called for most of the U.S. fighters to remain aloft over their own ships for their defense. This arrangement meant that the attack squadrons would be operating without fighter cover. Furthermore, no orders were given directing the bombers and torpedo planes to make a synchronized attack. Even by the standards of those early days of the war, the attack could not be considered well organized. But the command to hit the enemy's naval units was carried out on schedule. However inept the planning, the U.S. forces took the initiative with great determination. The burden of the search for the main body of the Japanese fleet fell principally on the carrier planes operating from the Yorktown and Lexington, since land-based Allied planes were only moderately helpful in spotting the enemy fleet as it proceeded toward New Guinea. The U.S. planes continued the search for several days. While the American planes were flying toward the enemy's surface force, a group of Japanese planes was searching for the U.S. ships. The pilots in both groups were hunting for big game, the enemy's warships, so they were not interested in looking for enemy planes. When the Japanese pilots spotted their targets, U.S. gunners were waiting for them. Units of the Japanese fleet were also discovered and zigzagged frantically to evade the American planes' attack. The U.S. planes sank a Japanese carrier early in the engagement. But during the 2 days of the main phase of the battle, Japanese planes met with great success in their strikes at the American fleet. Their principal targets were, of course, the carriers. At 11:18 a.m. on May 8th, Japanese planes attacked the Lexington. The loss of the Lexington was a heavy blow to the already crippled U.S. Pacific Fleet. In the key naval battle of the Coral Sea, losses were almost evenly divided as far as ships were concerned. But the Japanese invasion force had been successfully put to rout. All the ships sunk in this first battle in a new kind of naval engagement were hit by planes. The surface ships never exchanged a salvo. The planes shot down constituted a considerable percentage of the carrier attack groups. The Japanese failed to realize that their plans for future attacks against U.S. forces in the Pacific were no longer a Japanese secret. Shortly before the Battle of Coral Sea, the U.S. Navy had succeeded in breaking the Japanese code. This fortunate turn of events came at a point when the U.S. Pacific Fleet was in feeble condition to fight a war across the stretches of that vast ocean. As in the case of the Coral Sea, the U.S. Navy had advance information on the next Japanese strike. A planned attack on Midway Island, westernmost outpost of the Hawaiian archipelago. America's spent Pacific Fleet raced up from the south to meet the Japanese naval attack force. The U.S. fleet, reinforced by ships from the States, engaged the Japanese force, which had been counting on sneaking in unopposed on the island. In addition to its carriers, the U.S. had the advantage of having Midway itself as an added launching platform. The Army Air Force had sent 18 B-17s from Oahu to Midway just a few days before the enemy force was expected offshore. The Air Corps units reinforced the island's defense complement, which consisted of a Marine garrison and a Marine air group. The fighting men on the island readied themselves for a spirited battle as the expected enemy attack drew near. On May 30th, 1942, Midway-based planes began flying search missions. For several days, they continued the hunt. Finally, on June 3rd and 4th, the search proved successful. American planes from Midway were reinforced by carrier aircraft, and the most important single naval engagement of the war in the Pacific was begun. Most of it was fought in the air. The Japanese carrier-based planes sped to the attack, intent on knocking out the American airstrip and emplacements on Midway. But their arrival came as no surprise to the troops on the island. The island and its garrison took a heavy pounding, but successfully withstood the intensive raid. During the frenzied three-day battle, the Japanese maneuvered desperately in an attempt to evade American planes, which were performing magnificently in the decisive engagement. American carrier-based aircraft, assisted by land-based planes, turned the tide of war in the Pacific off the island of Midway. Japan's sweep of aggression in the Pacific was brought to a sudden, jarring halt at Midway. U.S. Navy, Marine, and Air Force pilots radically changed the complexion of the engagement, which the Japanese Navy had fully expected would be another triumph for the Emperor. U.S. torpedo planes off the carriers made heroic, low-level attacks on the enemy's ships. Supporting U.S. planes scored several hits. All the Japanese heavy carriers which participated in the Battle of Midway were put out of action during the engagement. The sea and air surrounding Midway were once again clear of the enemy. The U.S. fleet lost the Yorktown, but made the Japanese pay heavily. The American victory ended the threat to Hawaii and the west coast of the U.S. The Battle of Midway was the first decisive defeat the Japanese Navy had suffered in 350 years. At Midway, the new role of air power in naval war was accentuated. The U.S. Pacific Fleet still faced a gigantic job of fighting across the far-flung Pacific, but the outlook had become much brighter. 2 months later, at an island in the South Pacific most people had never heard of, the first ground offensive by American forces in any theater was launched against the enemy. On August 7, 1942, U.S. Marines invaded Guadalcanal.
Freedom and justice forward will be let the harmony come. But freedom comes and life in eternal vigilance. Go forward and of courage in the freedom fight. Let every man feel your